One of the most powerful financial machines in modern history is starting to show cracks, not because some internet conspiracy channel said so, not because somebody found a secret treaty in a dusty basement, because the real-world incentives that supported that machine for decades are changing in plain sight, and the institutions that matter most are already reacting. That machine is the petrodollar system. And if you understand what it actually is, how it actually worked, and why central banks are now buying gold as if the world has become less trustworthy than the spreadsheets imply, then you will understand something most investors still do not. This is not mainly an oil story. It is a reserve story, a settlement story, a trust story, a question of what the world wants to hold when the old architecture starts looking less permanent than it once did. Now let me begin by cleaning up the first distortion in the source material. There was no formal 50-year petrodollar treaty with Saudi Arabia that expired on some magical date and turned the whole system off like a light switch. The 1974 foundation was the U.S.-Saudi Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation, established in June 1974, which was part of a broader strategic relationship after the oil shock. The modern mythology of a single expiring contract is exactly that mythology that matters. Because if you start with a fake history, you will end with fake conclusions. The real petrodollar system was always more informal, more political, and more incentive-driven than the simplistic version people like to repeat. And that makes it more interesting because what was built through incentives can also weaken through incentives. Now let us get the mechanics right. The petrodollar system worked because oil was overwhelmingly priced and settled in dollars, which meant countries needing oil needed dollars. Producers accumulated dollars. Those dollars often flowed back into us assets, especially treasuries. And because the U.S. provided security, military ties, market access, and a deep financial system, the arrangement reinforced itself. That gave the United States an extraordinary advantage. Call it exorbitant privilege, if you want the economist phrase. I call it a cheat code. The U.S. could run larger deficits more comfortably than most countries. It could finance itself more cheaply than it otherwise would. It could import real goods in exchange for paper claims that the rest of the world still wanted to hold. That is an astonishing privilege, and privileges survive until incentives stop supporting them. That is where the story gets interesting, because the machine is not collapsing in one dramatic motion, it is fracturing at the edges. And edge fractures matter because the center always looks strongest, right before confidence starts migrating. The first crack is political and strategic. The United Arab Emirates has now officially said it is leaving OPEC effective May 1, 2026, a major break with one of the oil world's core institutions. That does not mean every oil barrel tomorrow is suddenly outside the old structure. It does mean that one of the world's most important Gulf producers is no longer content to sit quietly inside the old cartel logic. And this matters more than people realize, because OPEC was never just about quotas. It was also about coherence, about the world believing that the core Gulf producers still moved as a bloc, still shared enough incentive alignment, still behaved like the old machine was worth preserving. When one of the key players steps out, the message is not merely about barrels. It is about autonomy. And autonomy in commodity systems often travels together with autonomy in settlement systems. That brings us to the second crack. The world has started building more pathways around the dollar. Not because the dollar is dead, not because some alternative is already won, because large countries now want optionality. India and the UAE signed a framework in 2023 allowing trade settlement in rupees and dirhams, and India made its first crude oil payment to the UAE in Indian rupees that same year. That single payment did not destroy the dollar, but it did demonstrate that oil settlement in non-dollar currency was no longer just theoretical. It had become operational. Again, the point is not to be melodramatic. The point is to notice direction. 1 rupee settlement does not replace the dollar, but it proves a route exists. And once routes exist, they can scale when incentives deepen. The UAE also formally joined BRICS in 2024. That does not mean BRICS is a coherent anti-dollar empire. Much of the commentary around BRICS is breathless nonsense. But it does mean key energy states are experimenting with institutions and relationships that are not centered entirely on Washington's preferred architecture. And then there is the third crack, which I think matters more than either of the first two. What are reserve managers doing with real money? Not what pundits say, not what YouTubers yell. What are central banks actually buying gold? That is the part that should make you sit up since 2022. Central banks have bought more than 1,000 metric tons of gold a year, more than double. the annual average of the previous 5 years. This buying wave accelerated after the freezing of Russia's foreign reserves in 2022. Once reserve managers saw that sovereign assets held in Western currencies and institutions could become politically vulnerable, gold stopped being a relic and returned to being what it has always been in moments of distrust: reserve insurance with no counterparty. That is the whole point. Gold does not need permission. It does not rely on a bank. It does not depend on whether a treaty alliance survives the next geopolitical shock. And that is why the central bank buying matters so much. They are not buying it because they think civilization is ending. They are buying it because the world has become less certain about reserve safety, less certain about reserve neutrality, and less certain that the old dollar system can be treated as politically frictionless forever. That is a very different claim from the dollar is finished. The dollar is not finished. That needs to be said clearly because too many people ruin a good macro thesis by turning it into a cult. The dollar remains the dominant reserve currency, but the decline in its reserve share is real, even if gradual. That is the important nuance. We are not watching the dollar vanish. We are watching monopoly become less absolute. And when monopoly weakens price, insensitive buyers start diversifying the backup plan. That is where gold comes in, not as a religion, as a reserve alternative that has survived every currency regime because it is no one else's liability. Now, let me reduce the whole thesis into the 3Ds: de-dollarization, debasement, diversification. First, de-dollarization. That does not mean no more dollars. It means more trade and more reserves are slowly finding non-dollar routes at the margin. UAE moves, BRICS membership, rupee settlement, yuan usage in sanctioned systems, gradual reserve share erosion. None of these things alone is the end of the dollar. Together, they form a pattern. Second, debasement. The U.S. can still fund itself more easily than almost anyone else. That remains true. But with huge deficits and a political culture that prefers easier money to painful austerity, the long-run pressure to cheapen the real value of liabilities never fully goes away. Gold likes that environment because gold cannot be printed. That is not ideology. That is arithmetic. Third, diversification. If you are a reserve manager, a sovereign fund, or a central bank in a fragmented world, concentration in one currency and one geopolitical bloc starts looking less like prudence and more like a portfolio bet. You may not want to explain later, gold is diversification without counterparty risk. That is why it keeps getting bought. Now, let us talk about what this means for ordinary investors. It does not mean sell everything and live in a bunker with Krugerrands under the floorboards. That is not serious. It does mean you should stop thinking about gold as a costume accessory for doomsday people. Gold is increasingly behaving like reserve diversification for institutions that actually matter. And when institutions start buying for structural reasons rather than for speculation, that changes the character of the asset. There are several ways to position. Physical gold if you want direct possession and no financial intermediary between you and the metal. Gold ETFs if you want liquid market access without dealing with storage and insurance. Gold miners if you want operational leverage to the gold price and can tolerate that miners are businesses first and gold vehicles second. That last category is where people get hurt if they are lazy. A miner is not a bar of gold with a stock ticker. It has management risk, cost inflation, political jurisdiction risk, energy input risk, and all the usual human errors that infect businesses. But when gold runs hard and miners have been left behind, the catch-up can be violent. And that is where asymmetric opportunity often lives. Not in the obvious metal itself, but in the lagging equity layer beneath it. Now, let me bring this home. The smart way to read this is not: the petrodollar is dead. That is lazy. The smart way to read this is that the old machine is losing some of its unquestioned grip. The UAE is leaving OPEC. Non-dollar settlement routes have already been demonstrated. Central banks are still buying gold at extraordinary levels. The dollar's reserve share is drifting down. Not collapsing, but drifting. And that is enough to justify rethinking what sits inside a resilient portfolio, enough to justify treating gold not as superstition, but as a serious macro asset. Enough to understand that when the institutions closest to the global plumbing start hoarding metal with no counterparty risk, they are telling you something about the world they think is coming, not apocalypse. More fragmentation, more distrust, more incentive to own at least some piece of the system that does not depend on anyone. Promise. That is why gold knows what is happening. Not because gold is magical, because institutions do. and they have been voting with real money for years. The crowd will see it later. That is usually how these things work.